I met Nancy and Tracy for the first time when I was 14 years old, and they were my first anorexic friends. Nancy became anorexic when she left home for school. She was close to her mom like I was and had difficulties leaving her family to become independent. I sympathized with her. Growing up and leaving home was one of my biggest fears. I didn't feel I would ever be ready to do that. Tracy was an actress. The pressures of the job and hearing snide comments about her weight from producers pushed her into a cycle of self-destruction, so much so that she was taken off the television series that made her a star until she received treatment. Nancy and Tracy became my best friends. They were the only people I felt who could actually understand me. They articulated feelings and fears that I couldn't voice to anyone. They spoke my language. In treatment, I wasn't allowed to make friends with any of the other patients. Our doctors were too worried that friendships between patients would encourage our disorder. They were worried we'd exchange tips and compete to be sicker. And so my friendship with Nancy and Tracy was kept a secret, my very special secret. I must admit, there were times when our friendship intensified my anorexic thoughts. There were times when I wanted to be as frail as Tracy had gotten, or to reach those low weights Nancy had achieved. But by the time I got to know them, my two wonderful friends had already gotten better. And much more than they inspired me to be sicker, they encouraged me to think that maybe, just maybe, I could get better too. Seeing them stand strong, smiling, living, it gave me hope. I had never seen anyone live life after anorexia before. All of a sudden, that seemed like a possibility. I thought about Nancy and Tracy all the time, and they helped me feel less alone, which was the way I normally felt, especially when I was among people that I was supposed to feel I belonged with, like in school or around my family. I met Nancy and Tracy when I was 14 years old, when the movie For the Love of Nancy came on TV. Nancy was the fictional titular character in this film, the first eating disorders movie I had ever seen, and Tracy Gold was the actress who played her. I never actually met them. We never exchanged a word. But they remained my best friends for years. I'm Liron Cohen.
I'm Karin.
And we are changing the conversation about eating disorders.
You mentioned that as an adolescent patient, you weren't allowed to make friends with other patients. So I wanted to know, were you also discouraged from watching films or reading books about eating disorders? Or did you keep your emotional attachment to this film a secret because it felt too close to friendship?
You know, I love that you ask me these questions because it's things that I've never thought of before. And I'm actually oftentimes kind of surprised by my own answer. Because surprisingly enough, I wasn't discouraged from watching. More than that, not only was I not discouraged from watching movies or reading books, I was sort of my therapist's expert at the time. I gave her copies of all the movies that I've seen. I was in charge of letting her know whenever there was something new she needed to keep up with in terms of popular culture and media regarding eating disorders. So no, I wasn't hiding that, but she was the only person, my therapist was the only person actually that I wasn't hiding it from. From everybody else, it was a secret, especially my parents. I would only watch it sneakily when they weren't around. But the friendship aspect of the relationship I had with these movies, that I did keep secret because that part was supposedly the pathological part, because it was, for all intents and purposes, it was like making friends with a fellow patient because the highs and the lows, the emotional attachment, the emotional influence that it had on me, for better or worse.
So why did you feel like you had to hide this from your parents specifically?
I think there were a couple of aspects to this. The first being that I felt very exposed when I was watching these movies. I felt like I didn't want them to be a part of that. That was something sacred that was mine and mine alone. At times I was supposed to be in treatment. I was supposed to be getting better, and I didn't want them to know that I was very much obsessing over everything that had to do with anorexia while I was supposed to be, getting better. So, yeah.
And when you say friendship, what exactly do you mean? How did this friendship take shape in your daily life?
Well, I was very isolated, both because of the anorexia, and the anorexia was the result of being isolated. I didn't enjoy school life. I had been bullied. I didn't have too many friends. And so I needed these imaginary friends. And what it meant was that in my mind, I had conversations with them. They understood me. They provided me comfort. And again, when I was in situations that were distressing to me, or when I felt alone in a crowd, especially, as I said in the story, especially in places where I was supposed to feel like I belonged, but I didn't feel like I belonged, then I had this rich inner world that I had access to, even if nobody else could see it, where I felt I was understood and among my people.
I'm mulling over the phrase that you used, among my people.
Well, as I said, they spoke my language. There are certain things that you do or say that somebody else who doesn't have an eating disorder or who is not well versed in the eating disorders world would not understand, would not see. Most of the time it will probably just be completely invisible to a person who doesn't understand. But people with eating disorders immediately can see, immediately can understand. There are certain things that I can say to somebody that would mean nothing to another person, but the other person with eating disorders would know exactly what I'm talking about.
So this leads me to wonder whether things changed for you once you actually started meeting more people with eating disorders. Like after you entered inpatient treatment, for example, did you feel like you needed these movies less?
Movies have always been a big part of my life. So probably no, but I didn't need the imaginary friendship as much as I needed them before, and this is actually when I was hospitalized, and as somebody with OCD and social anxiety and a lot of other problems besides the anorexia, it was very hard for me to start this new treatment in a new place with new people. It was very intense. And the only thing that every day made me stay was the fact that all of a sudden I was surrounded by people who spoke my language. I had friends who understood me. I was having conversations that meant so much to me. And so, in fact, I know that the doctors before that were worried about competition, about bad influence between patients. But I found that when I was in the right environment with the right people, that was actually hugely helpful to my recovery.
Have you watched this film recently? Can you share a bit about how you feel about it now?
I still love the movie. Since then, I've seen a lot of eating disorders movies. I've developed more friendships with other wonderful characters. And recently, actually, I've watched all the movies again. And what I find interesting is the movie still holds, to me at least. When I watch it, it still moves me. I still think that it's the best film that I've seen made about eating disorders. But again, there were other very good movies. But what's interesting to see is how the movies and the representations of the person with the eating disorders, specifically the woman or the young woman with the eating disorders in the movies, has evolved, or should I say devolved over the years and the decades. But I still feel very strongly about the film, and I still, as somebody who, again, movies are very much a big part of my life, and that's what I do. I critique movies and TV shows. I still find them to be very important, at least in my eating disorder progression.
Something I found particularly interesting about your story was that viewing this film opened new possibilities for you, because the film conveyed to you that recovery was possible.
I think eating disorders movies in general, especially in the 90s, tended to end with either with recovery or at least the potential for recovery, sort of the typical American happy ending. But what I found interesting, again, was how that changed over the years. The movies of the 90s, to me, felt very real. The disorder felt real. The characters felt real. And the recovery or the potential for recovery felt real. I could identify with the movies. I could identify with the characters. And as much as they took me back to some very tough experiences and feelings, they also gave me hope, and they inspired me. The movies of the 2000s, something interesting started happening there. The movies of the new millennium, I found to be fascinated, almost obsessed with the pro-Ana phenomenon. And they depicted the patients as mean, almost perverse. I did not relate to them in any way. In fact, they offended me quite a bit, if not infuriated me. They completely switched sides, and now the patient is depicted as somebody almost sinister. I think there are a couple of things here. I think that there is the fact that, first of all, eating disorders have become so much a part of society and culture that they're not seen so much as something that we need to examine or investigate or try to get to the bottom of anymore. Maybe the new movies didn't think that eating disorders on their own are interesting enough, and now we have to bring in this other aspect that will make it seem almost like a thriller or, something more tantalizing. That's one option, one aspect of the answer. I think that the advent of internet, social media, which brought on pro-Ana. Pro-Ana is something that is very delicious for media, for movies and television, because it has, again, these aspects of thriller, and it's something that is easy to sensationalize and make people interested in. So I think actually this topic of movies and the changes throughout the decades in the depiction of the eating disorders patient leads very organically to the discussion of pro-Ana, which we'll talk about next month. So make sure that you all tune in. I want to know your experiences with eating disorders representations in movies and television.
Well, I haven't had as much experience with eating disorders films as you have, but I did write a story about the first time I saw eating disorders depicted on television, and hopefully it'll start an interesting discussion. I first saw anorexia depicted on screen when I was still in primary school. It was a rerun of an old episode of the US television series Fame. Aimed at a teenage audience, Fame was a fictional musical drama that followed the lives of high school students enrolled in an arts academy in New York. The episode I saw, named Reflections, focused on one character, Holly, as she developed anorexia, was hospitalized, experienced the death of a friend in hospital, and was jolted into recovering. In the course of just 40 televisual minutes, Holly was transformed, her journey from anorexia to recovery concluding with her exuberant participation in a school dance. At the time, I didn't know what anorexia was. I had never heard of this condition before, and I remember being particularly transfixed by the mealtime scene, where Holly furtively discarded her minutely cut food, throwing it away unbeknownst to her parents. In fact, it was this scene that remained with me years later, even after I had forgotten the rest of the plot. This episode of Fame was originally broadcast in 1985, but its narrative template and its focus on domestic food refusal scenes can be seen in many, much more recent programs and made-for-television films. I find it telling, and at times frustrating, that when anorexia is portrayed televisually, it is often through training the viewer's gaze on food practices, depicted as other and disordered. This focus on food practices, I feel, does much to spectacularize anorexia, but does little to promote understandings of what it means to live with an eating disorder. For me, one film stands out in this televisual landscape. Actually, it's not a film, but a music video, which, with a running time of 3 minutes and 38 seconds, offers a striking portrayal of anorexic experience. The video is for a song titled Anna's Song by the Australian band Silverchair. Released in 1999, Anna's Song is lead singer Daniel John's ambivalent love-hate letter to his own anorexia. In the video, scenes of John's, either alone or with his bandmates, are interwoven with scenes of a young woman frantically washing her hands, the sink gradually filling with blood as her hands grow red and raw with hot water and soap. While she washes her hands, the woman, in visible distress, looks in the mirror, seeing her hands as if covered with thick mud. The video ends with her standing on a rock at the seaside, imagining her hands controlling the movement of waves, only to wake, crying, collapsing on the bathroom floor, recognizing the reality of her injured hands. What I find particularly powerful about this video is that it captures anorexia experientially. Rather than inviting viewers to watch how others practice anorexia, it invites viewers to connect with how people live with anorexia. In shifting the focus away from food and toward cleanliness, the video also touches on a central experience in the lives of many people with anorexia, an experience anthropologist Megan Warren writes about in her book, Abject Relations. In this book, Warren explores the lives of people with anorexia with particular focus on the participants' experiences of the body and of food as unclean or impure, and of anorexia as a way of cleansing, purifying, and transforming the self. The video for Anna's song, in my view, effectively distills this complex and often difficult to explain sensory experience, showing the potential that televisual media have to change popular narratives about the lives of people with eating disorders.
So you said that you watched that episode of Fame when you were a young girl. And the fact that it stuck with you, especially that scene of cutting the food, I find quite amazing because it obviously left quite an impression on you. Why do you think that specific scene and the episode in general stayed with you all these years?
As you said, I was very young, and I haven't gone back to this episode for years now, so I really don't remember. But perhaps it was the simple fact that it seemed so different from the family meals that I had experienced until that point. And maybe it was also the way that the scene was framed. I suspect that perhaps by focusing on this particular food practice, the director was inviting us as viewers to focus on this, to think about it as central to the episode.
And you've talked about quote unquote weird food rituals and lying as something that movies tend to focus on in order to kind of sensationalize eating disorders to the audience. However, they are unfortunately quite common practices for people with eating disorders, and they're actually a central issue when a person has an eating disorder, because you do have to go through the day, especially if you're living with other people, lying, making excuses, finding all sorts of elaborate ways to discard a food and hide your disorder. And so I'm wondering, I've always seen it as, I've seen these scenes or these practices depicted in films as a way to educate parents and friends as to how to recognize disordered behavior. But why do you think that those practices don't belong in films about eating disorders?
I'm not suggesting that depictions of food practices don't belong in films about eating disorders, because obviously food is central to experiences of eating disorders, and it should definitely be a part of these televisual depictions. But I also think that a focus on food practices, to the exclusion of other aspects of eating disorders, ends up providing an outsider understanding of eating disorders that might position them as problems to be detected and resolved rather than experiences to be understood. So, of course, awareness raising has its merit, but I also think that restricting the depiction of eating disorders in television and film to the realm of education and awareness raising doesn't really promote understandings of what it means to live with an eating disorder, and also doesn't allow us to understand why people often hold on to their eating disorders.
It's interesting because you're talking about a 40-minute episode being way too short to really capture the experience of eating disorders, and yet a 3-minute music video did do that. So it's not really about time, it's about what you do with that time. And I wonder if you if you remember a TV show episode or a movie that did manage, for you at least, because I can tell you my experience with this, that did manage to capture both, the more sensationalized practices, but also the experience, the suffering, the mindset, etc.
Yeah, so I was actually going to say that because I haven't really watched that many films and television programs that feature eating disorders, perhaps I should turn the question back to you. And just to clarify, we're of course talking about fictional films and not about documentaries, because documentaries deserve their own episode.
So going back to For the Love of Nancy, which was one of the reasons that I loved it so much, I specifically want to talk about one scene in that movie, which really, especially at the time, just overwhelmed me with emotions because I felt that it captured the experience so well. There's a scene where Nancy's parents are driving her, they're driving to a courthouse because they're trying to get legal guardianship over her medical condition. But besides the point, she's in the back seat and she is watching life go by. She's watching people walking around, with strollers and having picnics and playing, and the look on her face of everything that she's missing, but knowing that as much as she would like to be part of that world, that's the world that scares her. That's the world that pushed her to developing the eating disorder. I don't know how other people saw it. I don't know how, people just watching this movie that have nothing to do with eating disorders, I don't know what they took away from this scene. But to me, that those 4 minutes, or 3 minutes, or however much it was, just captured the experience so well. And the movie in general did touch on, food practices and other things, but mostly it managed to showcase the social isolation, the fear. Speaking of how people with eating disorders watch and dissect or respond to eating disorders, movies and TV shows, as opposed to people without an eating disorder, I wonder what you look for or what moves you in a movie about eating disorders. Because I know for example, that you loved the movie Sharing the Secret, which I didn't respond to almost at all. So I wonder what, for example, in that movie touched you so much.
Well, it's been years since I've seen that film, but I remember that the aspect of it that I found most powerful was that it paid attention to the fears that the lead character had about the world, about existence. And I thought that was something that is not really talked about. It actually links up with what we discussed in a previous podcast episode about how it's easy to grasp those fears that have to do with food and the body, but actually people with eating disorders experience anxieties about so much more than that. And so that was something that I really appreciated about that film.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation. As you know, this is my favorite topic, movies. And as we mentioned, our next episode is going to go into Pro Ana, which is something that really, really puzzles a lot of people, and we would like to try to break it down a little bit.
Thank you for joining us in Changing the Conversation. Feel free to email us at any time with comments, questions, or anything else to changetheconvoed@gmail.com.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media, where we also have links to other resources and further reading. Look for Changing the Conversation About Eating Disorders on Facebook and at ChangeConvoED on Twitter.
We hope you join us again for our next episode on the first Tuesday of next month.